That memory hurts now. The closer we got to my neighborhood, the stranger things became. Traffic looked unusually crowded near my street. Luxury cars lined both sides of the road. Music echoed faintly through the air somewhere ahead. At first, I assumed someone nearby hosted a big party. Then the taxi turned onto my block. And I froze instantly. White tents covered my backyard completely. Professional valet attendants stood near my driveway. Dozens of formally dressed guests walked around laughing with champagne glasses in their hands. For a second, my brain genuinely refused to process what I was seeing. I actually looked at the driver thinking maybe he brought me to the wrong address accidentally. But then I saw my best friend Marcus near the entrance. My mother's car parked beside the curb. Vanessa's parents greeting guests. Every piece of confusion suddenly turned into panic all at once. My hands literally went numb. "What the hell?" I whispered. I stepped out of the taxi slowly carrying my suitcase while nobody noticed me initially because all attention remained focused toward the backyard ceremony setup. Then I heard music begin softly. Wedding music. My stomach dropped immediately. Still confused, I moved toward the side gate carefully while guests continued smiling and talking around me, completely unaware the groom they expected hadn't arrived yet. Then finally, I looked through the open backyard entrance, and my entire world collapsed. Vanessa stood at the altar wearing a white wedding dress. Beautiful. Smiling. Holding another man's hand. My heartbeat physically stopped for a second. Because 6 days earlier she told me she loved me before sleeping. 3 days earlier she discussed honeymoon plans with me over FaceTime. And now, she stood inside my backyard marrying someone else while nearly everyone I loved watched it happen. Then suddenly, the groom looked directly toward the gate. Toward me. And instead of panic, he smiled. The moment the groom smiled at me, I realized something terrifying. He wasn't surprised to see me. Which meant one thing. He already knew who I was. And somehow, that hurt even more than seeing Vanessa in the wedding dress itself. For a few seconds, I just stood frozen behind the backyard gate while the ceremony music continued softly around me like some twisted movie scene. Guests smiled. Waiters carried champagne trays. People laughed casually beneath white decorations while my entire life collapsed silently in the middle of it all. And nobody stopped it. Nobody warned me. Not my family. Not my friends. No one. I remember gripping the handle of my suitcase so tightly my hands started shaking. My brain kept trying to create logical explanations because reality looked too insane to accept immediately. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe a fake ceremony. Maybe a misunderstanding somehow. But deep down, I already knew the truth. Vanessa suddenly noticed movement near the gate. Her eyes shifted toward me casually at first. Then her entire body froze. I'll never forget that expression. Pure horror. The flowers nearly slipped from her hands instantly while all color disappeared from her face. For one brief second, nobody else noticed what happened. Then she whispered my name. Quietly. Almost like she saw a ghost. The groom turned toward her pretending confusion while still holding her hand. "What's wrong?" he asked calmly. Calmly. Like he belonged there. Like I didn't. That was the moment something inside me snapped emotionally. I stepped fully through the gate now, still carrying my suitcase, travel jacket hanging over my arm while dozens of guests slowly turned toward me one by one. The music stopped. Conversations died instantly. And suddenly every single person there looked uncomfortable. Interesting. Because guilty people always recognize the victim the moment he arrives. "Can somebody explain what the hell this is?" I asked quietly. Not yelling. Not emotional. Just stunned. Nobody answered immediately. Vanessa looked physically unable to speak. My mother couldn't even look me in the eyes. Marcus stared down at the ground like a man waiting for impact. And then finally, Vanessa whispered, "You weren't supposed to be home until Friday." That sentence hit harder than anything else could have. Not apology. Not explanation. Just panic because the timing of her lie got ruined. I laughed once after hearing it. A broken laugh. Because suddenly the entire situation became horrifyingly clear. This wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't confusion. This had been planned carefully around my absence. The groom finally stepped forward trying to position himself protectively beside Vanessa like some kind of hero. His confidence irritated me instantly. "Listen, man." "No," I interrupted sharply. "You listen." The entire backyard went dead silent. I stared directly into his eyes for the first time now. Tall guy. Expensive suit. Maybe early 40s. The kind of polished arrogance wealthy people mistake for charm. "How long?" I asked quietly. He glanced at Vanessa briefly before answering. "A year." "A year." My stomach twisted violently hearing it spoken aloud. Because that meant while Vanessa planned our wedding, she was secretly planning another one too. At the same time. Same house. Same backyard. Probably same guess. God. The humiliation burned through me instantly. You've been sleeping beside me for a year while this was happening? I asked Vanessa quietly. Fresh tears filled her eyes immediately. It's complicated. I almost lost control hearing that sentence. Complicated. People always use that word when they want betrayal to sound sophisticated instead of selfish. No, I said coldly. It's actually very simple. Vanessa tried stepping toward me now. Please let me explain. You invited my family to your wedding with another man in my own backyard. Silence. Heavy silence. Because suddenly everyone there realized how insane the situation truly looked once spoken out loud. My eyes moved slowly across the crowd afterward. And honestly, that part hurt most. Recognizing faces. Friends. Cousins. People who smiled in my face for months while secretly knowing what Vanessa was doing behind my back. You all knew? I asked quietly. Nobody answered. Which became the answer itself. I looked directly at Marcus next. My best friend since college. The man who once told me I'd be the best husband out of everyone we knew. You too. Marcus looked sick emotionally. I tried talking her out of this, he said softly. Interesting choice of words. Not, I warned you. Not, I stopped it. Just, I tried talking her out of this. Meaning everybody already accepted betrayal privately long before I discovered it publicly. Vanessa started crying now. Real crying. But honestly, it only made me angrier. Because tears after exposure aren't always remorse. Sometimes they're fear. You were really never going to tell me? I asked her quietly. She shook her head emotionally. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Again with that phrase. Like betrayal only became tragic because I arrived early. The groom suddenly stepped closer again, clearly irritated by the emotional chaos. Maybe this conversation should happen privately. I stared at him in disbelief. Privately? Inside my own house. At his wedding to my fiancée? The audacity almost impressed me. Then suddenly something occurred to me that made the entire situation even darker. I looked back toward the decorations carefully. The flowers. The music. The setup. And then I realized, half this wedding looked identical to the one Vanessa and I planned together. Same colors. Same designer. Same violinist. She didn't just replace me emotionally. She recycled our entire future for another man. That realization physically hurt. Because it meant I was never even unique enough to mourn properly. Just replaceable. Disposable. A placeholder inside someone else's selfish story. Vanessa noticed me looking around the backyard and immediately understood what I realized too. Fresh guilt flooded her face instantly. I can explain that. No, I interrupted softly. You really can't. For several seconds nobody moved. Then finally, I asked the question that truly mattered. Why? The backyard remained completely silent waiting for her answer. And honestly, part of me still hoped there'd be some explanation painful enough to at least make sense emotionally. But when Vanessa finally spoke, her answer destroyed me even more. I stopped feeling certain about us, she whispered. I stopped feeling certain about us. That was Vanessa's answer. Not abuse. Not betrayal from me. Not some horrible secret I deserved punishment for. Just uncertainty. And somehow, hearing that made the entire situation feel even crueler. Because uncertainty is normal. Every long relationship goes through moments where people question things internally. Marriage isn't built on permanent butterflies and perfect emotions. Real commitment means communicating before selfishness turns into destruction. But Vanessa didn't communicate. She replaced me quietly while still accepting my love every single day. And worst of all, she let me continue building a future that no longer existed. The backyard remained painfully silent after her confession. Guests avoided eye contact. Some looked embarrassed enough to leave already, while others stood frozen like they accidentally wandered into a tragedy instead of a wedding. I stared at Vanessa for several seconds trying to recognize the woman standing in front of me. And honestly, I couldn't anymore. You stopped feeling certain, I repeated slowly. So your solution was secretly planning another wedding while pretending ours still existed? Fresh tears rolled down her face instantly. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Again. That sentence. Like the problem wasn't betrayal itself. Just the fact I discovered it publicly. The groom, whose name I later learned was Daniel, stepped closer beside her again like he wanted to protect her emotionally from me. That pissed me off instantly. Not because I felt threatened. Because he looked comfortable. Too comfortable. Like a man already settled inside a life that technically still belonged to someone else. You knew she was engaged? I asked him coldly. Yes. No shame. No hesitation. Just confidence. Interesting. And you still thought this was acceptable? Daniel sighed slightly like I was creating unnecessary drama. She told me the relationship was already over emotionally. That sentence nearly made me laugh. Emotionally over. Funny how people invent invisible breakups privately so they can cheat without guilt publicly. I looked back toward Vanessa again. You told him that? She lowered her eyes silently. Which answered enough. The humiliation burning through me by then became unbearable. Not just because of the cheating. Because of how thoroughly I'd been erased from my own life without knowing it. The wedding venue. The guests. The planning. Even my own house. Everything around me suddenly felt stolen. And the worst realization came next. I owned the property. Completely. Vanessa's name was never added officially because her credit issues complicated financing during the purchase process. At the time, I told her it didn't matter because once we married, everything would belong to both of us anyway. God. Sometimes love really does make people dangerously blind. I slowly looked around the backyard again, now noticing details differently. The expensive flower arrangements I paid deposits on months earlier. The custom lighting. The marble dance floor installation. Even the violin quartet near the altar. Almost every piece of that wedding had been funded using accounts connected to me. Vanessa saw realization hit my face instantly. And suddenly, she looked nervous for the first time since I arrived. Real nervous. You used my money for this? I asked quietly. Silence. Then. We were going to explain everything afterward. I physically turned away for a second after hearing that because my anger nearly exploded completely. Explain afterward. Meaning the plan was literally to marry another man in my backyard while I remained overseas? Then deal with the emotional consequences later once the wedding already happened. That level of selfishness felt almost inhuman. My mother suddenly stepped toward me carefully. Son. I looked at her immediately. And honestly, that betrayal hurt differently. Because mothers are supposed to protect their children from pain. Not quietly attend it. You knew? I asked softly. Her eyes filled with tears immediately. I didn't know what to do. Wrong answer. Because there was something to do. Tell me. Warn me. Anything. Instead, she stood in my backyard smiling through rehearsals while my fiancé married another man behind my back. I stepped backward slowly, now feeling emotionally suffocated by everyone around me. The entire scene started feeling surreal. Like I accidentally entered an alternate reality where everybody agreed my humiliation was acceptable as long as it avoided conflict temporarily. That's when I noticed something strange near the gift table. Photos. Large framed engagement photos. Of Vanessa and Daniel. Inside my house. In my backyard. Displayed publicly like their relationship had existed openly forever. I walked toward them slowly while people moved aside silently. And the moment I looked closer, my stomach dropped completely. Some photos were taken inside places Vanessa and I visited together during our relationship. Restaurants, vacation spots, even one beach resort we originally traveled to for our anniversary. She literally recreated parts of our relationship with another man while still living beside me. That realization finally broke something emotionally inside me. Not loudly. Quietly. Like a rope snapping under too much weight. You know what hurts most? I said softly without turning around. Nobody answered. I would have forgiven honesty. Silence filled the backyard instantly. Because it was true. If Vanessa came to me months earlier admitting confusion, uncertainty, even feelings for someone else, we could have ended things painfully but respectfully. Instead she chose deception. Humiliation. Replacement. I finally turned back toward her afterward. And honestly, for the first time since arriving home, I saw regret in her face. Real regret. Not because she loved me suddenly. Because reality finally looked uglier than fantasy. Please, she whispered emotionally. Can we talk privately? I stared at her wedding dress for several seconds before answering. No. That word visibly shattered her. Because suddenly she realized something important. She no longer controlled the situation. For months she managed both worlds carefully. Loving fiancé publicly, secret relationship privately. But now, everything collided. And everyone could finally see the truth. Daniel stepped closer protectively again, clearly uncomfortable with Vanessa emotionally unraveling in front of the guests. We should probably end this. I looked directly at him afterward. "Oh, this ends today," I replied calmly. Then I reached into my pocket slowly and pulled out my house keys. The entire backyard went silent again, watching me. And then, without breaking eye contact with either of them, I tossed the keys directly onto the grass beside the altar. "You two clearly wanted the house more than the relationship," I said quietly. "Congratulations." Vanessa immediately started crying harder. But I wasn't finished yet, because deep down, I had just realized something they hadn't considered at all. The house legally belonged to me, and by morning, everything inside their fantasy wedding was about to collapse. The moment I dropped the house keys beside the altar, the entire atmosphere changed. Not emotionally, legally. And judging by the panic suddenly spreading across Vanessa's face, she realized it too. Because for the first time since I walked into that backyard, she remembered something extremely important. The house wasn't hers. Not even partially. I watched her eyes shift toward Daniel nervously while guests whispered quietly among themselves. Some people had already started leaving awkwardly, clearly realizing this wedding had transformed into a public disaster nobody wanted attached to their name later. Daniel still tried maintaining confidence though. That almost impressed me. "You're being emotional right now," he said carefully. "Maybe everybody needs space." I actually laughed hearing that. Emotional. Interesting word coming from a man standing inside another man's backyard marrying his fiancée. "No," I replied calmly. "What I'm being is practical." Then I pulled my phone from my pocket and made a call. Right there in front of everyone. Vanessa immediately looked terrified. "Who are you calling?" "My attorney." That answer physically changed the energy around the wedding instantly. Because suddenly this stopped being relationship drama. Now it became consequences. "You don't need lawyers involved," Vanessa said quickly while stepping toward me. I stared at her in disbelief. "You held a wedding with another man in my backyard while I was overseas." Fresh tears rolled down her face again. "I was going to explain everything." "After the honeymoon?" Silence. "Exactly." My attorney, Richard, answered after 2 rings. I briefly explained the situation while dozens of guests awkwardly pretended not to listen nearby. "I need immediate private property enforcement," I said calmly. "Tonight." Richard went silent for a second. "Are you serious?" I looked directly at Vanessa standing beside the altar in her wedding dress while another man held her hand. Completely. Within 20 minutes, everything started unraveling. Security vehicles arrived first. Then 2 police officers shortly afterward to supervise potential escalation once Richard explained the property ownership situation officially. That's when the panic truly hit Vanessa. Because until that moment, I genuinely think part of her believed emotions would eventually smooth everything over somehow. But reality doesn't disappear just because people cry afterward. "This is humiliating," Daniel muttered angrily while watching officers approach the backyard. That sentence almost made me lose control completely. Humiliating? Interesting perspective coming from the man literally stealing someone's life behind their back. "You should have thought about humiliation before planning your wedding at another man's house," I replied coldly. Guests began leaving rapidly after that. Some avoided eye contact entirely while rushing toward their cars. Others whispered apologies quietly on their way out like they suddenly remembered basic morality existed. Cowards. Every single one of them watched this happen silently until consequences arrived publicly. My mother tried speaking to me again near the driveway while catering staff awkwardly started packing equipment around us. "Please don't do this tonight," she whispered emotionally. I looked at her carefully. And honestly, I barely recognized anyone anymore. "You already picked a side when you sat in those chairs," I said quietly. That truth visibly hurt her. Good. Because betrayal shouldn't feel comfortable for the people helping it survive. Meanwhile, Vanessa had completely fallen apart emotionally. Makeup ruined. Hands shaking. Wedding dress dragging across wet grass while she argued desperately with Richard and the officers near the patio. "You can't remove us from the property tonight." Richard remained professionally calm. "Actually, legally we can." Daniel's confidence disappeared fast once paperwork entered the situation. Funny how arrogant people suddenly become practical once reality threatens their comfort directly. I stood near the backyard entrance silently watching everything collapse around them while exhaustion slowly replaced anger inside me. Because deep down, I think the heartbreak already burned itself out. All that remained now was clarity. Vanessa eventually broke away from the officers and rushed toward me desperately. "Please," she whispered crying. "Can we just talk alone for 5 minutes?" Part of me wanted to refuse immediately. But another part needed closure. So I nodded once and followed her toward the empty side patio away from everyone else. The moment we were alone, she completely broke down. "I never wanted to hurt you like this," she cried. I leaned silently against the railing, staring out toward the backyard where workers dismantled wedding decorations under security supervision. "You already did. That's not fair." I almost laughed hearing that. Fair. Interesting word considering the circumstances. "You emotionally replaced me while sleeping beside me every night," I said quietly. "Then planned a wedding in my own home while pretending ours still existed." She cried harder after hearing it spoken out loud. I was confused. "No," I interrupted calmly. "You were selfish." That silence afterward felt heavy. Because deep down, she knew it was true. "I loved you once," she whispered shakily. That sentence hurt unexpectedly. Not because I doubted it, because I believed it completely. And somehow that made everything sadder. "Then what happened?" I asked softly. Vanessa wiped beneath her eyes slowly before answering. "You changed." I frowned slightly. "How?" "You became obsessed with work. With building everything perfectly. We stopped feeling connected." She looked down toward the ground. Daniel made me feel seen again. There it was. The real explanation. Not money. Not manipulation. Emotional neglect mixed with selfishness. And honestly, part of what she said was probably true. I had worked constantly the past year. Wedding pressure, business expansion, financial responsibilities. Somewhere along the way we really had started drifting emotionally. But drifting isn't justification for betrayal. Adults communicate. Cowards replace people secretly. "You could have left honestly," I said quietly. Fresh tears appeared again instantly. "I know." And for the first time all night, I believed her regret was genuine. Not because she got caught. Because fantasy finally collided with reality. She looked back toward the collapsing wedding setup afterward and whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. "I ruined everything." I followed her gaze silently. The flowers being removed. Guests disappearing. Workers dismantling decorations built for a future that never actually existed. And strangely enough, I didn't feel victorious, just tired. Because revenge fantasies always feel emptier once reality arrives. Then suddenly Daniel shouted from near the driveway angrily. "Vanessa, we need to go now." That moment changed her face completely. For the first time all evening. She looked uncertain about him too. Interesting. Because relationships built through betrayal rarely survive public consequences well. I stared at her carefully afterward. And deep down, I realized something important. This wedding wasn't the beginning of their happy future. It was the beginning of their collapse too. By midnight the wedding was completely gone. The white tents disappeared first. Then the catering trucks left. The musicians packed their instruments quietly while avoiding eye contact with anyone. Workers dismantled flower arrangements worth thousands of dollars beneath dim backyard lights while rain started falling softly across the property. And standing there watching it all collapse, I realized something strange. I wasn't heartbroken anymore. Just empty. Because there's a point where betrayal becomes so overwhelming your emotions stop reacting normally. Your brain simply accepts reality to survive it. Vanessa remained near the driveway arguing quietly with Daniel while security supervised the removal of personal belongings from the house. From a distance, I could already see tension growing between them. Funny how quickly romance changes once consequences arrive. The same man who looked so confident at the altar now looked irritated, impatient, embarrassed. And Vanessa, still standing in her wedding dress, suddenly looked less like a bride and more like someone waking up from a terrible decision too late. I stood alone near the back patio holding a glass of whiskey someone abandoned earlier during the chaos. Rain tapped softly against the empty chairs surrounding the dance floor while workers loaded decorations into trucks one by one. That backyard was supposed to hold memories of my future family someday. Instead, it became the graveyard of my relationship. A few minutes later, footsteps approached behind me quietly. "Vanessa." I didn't turn around immediately. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then finally, "I think he's leaving," she whispered. I glanced toward the driveway where Daniel slammed a car door angrily before speaking with one of the officers near the front gate. Interesting. Not even 12 hours into their future together, and things already looked unstable. "What did you expect?" I asked calmly. Fresh tears filled her eyes instantly. "I know I deserve that." The honesty surprised me slightly. Because for the first time since I came home, she sounded completely stripped of excuses. "I really thought I was making the right choice," she admitted softly. I looked out across the destroyed wedding setup before answering. No, I replied quietly. You thought you were making the easier choice. That truth landed heavily between us. Because deep down, we both knew it was accurate. Daniel represented excitement, attention, escape from responsibility and emotional stagnation. But real relationships eventually become difficult no matter who you're with. And people who run from discomfort usually repeat destruction wherever they go next. Vanessa slowly sat down beside me near the patio table while rain continued falling around us. I used to imagine growing old here with you, she whispered. That sentence hurt more than I expected. Because once upon a time, so did I. For several minutes, we just sat there silently listening to workers clean up the ruins of a wedding that should have never existed. Then suddenly Vanessa asked the question I think she'd been terrified of all night. Did you ever really love me? I turned toward her carefully after hearing it. And honestly, that question made me sad more than angry. Yes, I answered immediately. No hesitation. Because despite everything she did, the love had been real for me. I loved you enough to build an entire future around you, I continued quietly. That's why this hurts the way it does. Tears rolled silently down her face. I didn't mean to destroy you. I almost smiled sadly hearing that. Because people rarely wake up planning destruction emotionally. They simply choose selfishness repeatedly until destruction becomes unavoidable. You didn't destroy me, I said calmly. That surprised her. You destroyed us. There's a difference. And deep down I think she understood exactly what I meant. Around 1 a.m, Daniel finally walked toward us looking exhausted and irritated. We need to go, he said sharply. Vanessa looked up slowly. And for the first time all night, I saw doubt in her eyes about him. Real doubt. Because reality had finally entered the fantasy relationship they built through secrecy. Daniel wasn't standing there like a soulmate anymore. He looked like a man trapped inside public humiliation he never expected to experience. Go where? Vanessa asked quietly. That question visibly annoyed him. My place obviously. Silence. Then Vanessa looked back toward the house. My house. The one she almost stole emotionally without realizing she never actually owned it legally. And suddenly, I think the full weight of her choices finally crushed her completely. Because in one night she lost everything. The wedding. The house. My trust. Even the fantasy version of Daniel she convinced herself existed. Fresh tears filled her eyes again. I don't think I can do this, she whispered. Daniel stared at her in disbelief. You're joking, right? No, she replied softly. That silence afterward felt enormous. Because suddenly the relationship built through betrayal started collapsing in real time right in front of me. Daniel laughed bitterly before shaking his head. Unbelievable. Then without another word, he walked away. Just like that. No dramatic speech. No fighting for her. Nothing. Interesting how quickly love disappears once comfort and fantasy disappear too. Vanessa watched his car leave through the rain while looking completely shattered emotionally. And honestly, part of me almost pitied her. Almost. Because standing there alone in her soaked wedding dress watching both futures disappear at once, she finally understood something painful. People who betray others usually overestimate how loyal their replacements actually are. Eventually the workers finished cleaning everything. The backyard became empty again. Quiet. Like none of it ever happened. Vanessa stood slowly afterward near the patio steps while rain fell softly around us. So this is really it? She whispered. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. And strangely enough, I felt peaceful for the first time all night. Yes, I said quietly. She nodded weakly while crying silently. Then after several seconds she whispered something that stayed with me long after she disappeared from my life. I think losing you is going to hurt forever. I believed her. Because regret lasts differently when people realize too late that they destroyed something real chasing something temporary. Vanessa walked away shortly afterward carrying nothing except a small overnight bag and the consequences of her own choices. I watched her disappear down the driveway through the rain until eventually she became smaller, and smaller, and finally gone. Then I stood alone in the backyard we once planned our future in. The lights were off. The flowers were gone. The wedding had vanished completely. And somehow, so had the illusion I spent 4 years believing in. But standing there beneath the rain, I finally understood something important. Sometimes losing the person you thought you'd marry is actually life saving you from the marriage that would have destroyed you later. My house. The one she almost stole emotionally without realizing she never actually owned it legally. And suddenly, I think the full weight of her choices finally crushed her completely. Because in one night she lost everything. The wedding, the house, my trust. Even the fantasy version of Daniel she convinced herself existed. Fresh tears filled her eyes again. "I don't think I can do this," she whispered. Daniel stared at her in disbelief. "You're joking, right?" "No," she replied softly. That silence afterward felt enormous. Because suddenly the relationship built through betrayal started collapsing in real time right in front of me. Daniel laughed bitterly before shaking his head. "Unbelievable." Then without another word, he walked away. Just like that. No dramatic speech. No fighting for her. Nothing. Interesting how quickly love disappears once comfort and fantasy disappear too. Vanessa watched his car leave through the rain while looking completely shattered emotionally. And honestly, part of me almost pitied her. Almost. Because standing there alone in her soaked wedding dress watching both futures disappear at once, she finally understood something painful. People who betray others usually overestimate how loyal their replacements actually are. Eventually the workers finished cleaning everything. The backyard became empty again. Quiet. Like none of it ever happened. Vanessa stood slowly afterward near the patio steps while rain fell softly around us. "So this is really it?" she whispered. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. And strangely enough, I felt peaceful for the first time all night. "Yes," I said quietly. She nodded weakly while crying silently. Then after several seconds she whispered something that stayed with me long after she disappeared from my life. "I think losing you is going to hurt forever." I believed her. Because regret lasts differently when people realize too late that they destroyed something real chasing something temporary. Vanessa walked away shortly afterward carrying nothing except a small overnight bag and the consequences of her own choices. I watched her disappear down the driveway through the rain until eventually she became smaller, and smaller, and finally gone. Then I stood alone in the backyard we once planned our future in. The lights were off. The flowers were gone. The wedding had vanished completely. And somehow, so had the illusion I spent 4 years believing in. But standing there beneath the rain, I finally understood something important. Sometimes losing the person you thought you'd marry is actually life saving you from the marriage that would have destroyed you later.